Good evening, and Gumba Malgan, Gumba Nani Ginadu, which is good evening. It's good to see you, which is in Barragum, the traditional language of the community that I grew up on the Darling Downs. My name is Vicky McDonald, and it's my great privilege to be the State Librarian and CEO here at the State Library of Queensland, your state library. And on behalf of my colleagues, I welcome you to this evening's Game Changers, the second for 2023, with architect Kevin O'Brien. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their continuing connection to land and as custodians of stories for millennia. At State Library of Queensland, we are inspired by this tradition in our work to share and preserve Queensland's memory for future generations. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our guest speaker this evening, Kevin O'Brien, our facilitator, Rhianna Patrick, who is also a member of the Library Board of Queensland's Indigenous Advisory Group, Professor Cameron Newton from QUT, members of the Library Board of Queensland, Queensland Library Foundation Council, and the Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame Management Committee and Induction Committee, and specifically Debbie Best, who's the Chair of the Library Board of Queensland, our founding partner, QUT, our other generous partners and sponsors of the Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame, Picture Partners, Channel 7, Morgans, Ray White, and the Springfield City Group. And of course, friends and supporters of State Library who are joining us online here at the library and online, obviously. And firstly, I congratulate all of you for having chosen to come to State Library of Queensland this evening to listen to Kevin O'Brien over Paul McCartney. Great choice, well done, thank you. And I think there's probably still people trying to get through the traffic as well to get here. So the Game Changers series has been a calendar highlight for over a decade, and in fact tonight is our 40th event. Game Changers is a Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame initiative made possible through our partnership with QUT. Together, we recognise and honour those who have made a significant contribution to Queensland. And it's an absolute pleasure to have the visionary Kevin O'Brien with us this evening. Kevin is a leading Australian architect who focuses on cultural activation in his design work. Kevin honours the inextricable connection between architecture and the land on which it sits. Tonight, you will hear about his influential career designing meaningful outcomes for communities and clients. Rhianna Patrick will be facilitating this evening's conversation, and Rhianna is a freelance Torres Strait Islander journalist, broadcaster and audio content creator with 25 years media and experience, and as I mentioned, also a member of our Indigenous Advisory Group. The conversation is being broadcast on State Library's website, so a warm welcome to everyone who is joining us online. This evening we'll be using Slido to collect questions from online viewers, also the people in the auditorium as well. So if you go to Slido, slido.com, and enter the event code QBLHOF, or simply scan the QR code that appears on the screen throughout the event. So we'll bring the QR code up during the event. So Rhianna will do her best to get to as many questions as possible. And if you are sharing your thoughts about tonight's conversation on social media, we encourage you to use the hashtag QBLHOF. Finally, I also invite you to visit our latest exhibition, Purpose Built exhibition, which is in our SLQ gallery on this level as you exit the building this evening. So Purpose Built explores the transformative potential of architectural design and its pivotal role in shaping communities and shifting perspectives of housing today. So I hope you enjoy the conversation, and now I'll invite Rhianna and Kevin to join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky, for that welcome. And as a Torres Strait Islander, I'm always on country which is not my own, and so I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present on whose lands we are gathering to have this conversation. And I just want to acknowledge their continued presence and connection to this place. And thank you, Kevin, for being here for Game Changers, which is obviously this conversation that brings together business, tech, creative industries, and looking at having those conversations to really get inside your head, and I'm really looking forward to that. I would also like to introduce our Auslan interpreters. Can you please give Candice and Kelly a round of applause as well and make them welcome? Just a bit of housekeeping. Emergency exits are via both doors, both at the front here and to the rear. If you need to leave the event, please go up the stairs, exit via the rear door. I feel like I'm directing you on a plane now. Please go up, go out the exits via the rear door and not this lower door here. And a big hello to everyone who is watching online as well. And for those in the auditorium, could you please turn your phone to silent but not off, because I would like to get your questions on the Slido a little later on. When I was asked to do this conversation with Kevin, it was very much a Jerry Maguire moment where I said, "You had me at Kevin." And I would have this conversation with Kevin. It doesn't matter where it was, I would say yes every time. But I remember learning about Kevin in the early 2000s when I'd first moved to Sydney to work, and hearing about this Miramar Aboriginal design unit that was doing this work, and getting an idea of who this Kevin O'Brien was as a fellow islander as well. You know, you're always sussing out the other islanders who are doing different things in different industries too. And I've felt a great privilege in being able to watch his practice over this time, and it's not just been in architecture but also the way that he works in architectural sculpture, the way that he works with art design in theatre, having seen his work hanging in the Gallery of Modern Art here in Queensland as well. I am a fangirl from way back. It's very obvious, isn't it? But I think that's one of the things that I've always loved about Kevin's work, is that it has always gone above and beyond, and while there's the work that you physically see, there's all this work underneath that I think we're going to find out about tonight, of the things that are going on in the background of what he's been trying to change as part of his work in architecture and design. And I mean, Kevin, the obvious place for me to start is how much of where you grew up influenced your decision to go into architecture.
Oh, well, I think your lived experience is everything. And I was lucky enough to grow up in Brisbane for most of my life and go back to the islands most Christmases. So I got to see two very different cultures, probably more immersed in my father's here and my mother's going back to the Torres Strait. So you notice the difference, because they're very, the people are different to start with and who you're with. If I go to the islands, everyone's related. So you know, you have a big family, and there's just a different way of being and living and being right next to the ocean, as you know. And here it was sort of trapped by houses with fences, and you couldn't sort of go where you'd like to. So I don't know, there's something kind of, there was a seed sown somehow about, you know, why is this place different and that place different? I didn't know what it was back in the day, but it sort of became apparent over time.
Yeah, so tell me about Hammond. For those who've never been, what kind of island is Hammond? Where is Hammond? And, you know, give me a sense of the place that you got to wander around on those holidays.
Yeah, so Hammond Island, which is the mission name for that place, its proper name's Kirrawee. It's in the Western Group, in the Torres Strait, next to Wyburn, which is Thursday Island. Curragh country. And a lot of people moved off at various points pre and post war. It's a big lump of granite with a big reef around it, and you have the Coral Sea on one side, the Arafura on the other, and you might get 3 or 4 tides a day. They're quite violent, the tides, as you know, during the course of the year. But fishing's like opening the fridge and taking something out. It's very quick. So I could never understand people fishing for hours down here. It just seemed slightly pointless. It's a beautiful place. And I think the other thing is, you know, the good and bad thing is I was just back there recently, the community there's 300 somehow, and thankfully Tasmania takes the heat off us. We're all related but not too related. It's a beautiful place, you know, going somewhere where you just know you belong to it.
Yeah, and I guess, you know, when it comes to structures on that island, you know, always interested in perspective that you have, that you were down here but you were also up there as well, and I guess that place of structure and how, how is structure used in the islands compared to, say, in a city?
Yeah, I think, that's a good question. I think the history of Kirui is such that there was a whole traditional form of building that was using all the local materials, and everything was very efficient and economical. And then I think with the coming of the light, 123 years ago, I think it is now, there was a slight difference in, I guess, the culture break, if you like. So what we then ended up with was a sort of a different kind of way of doing things, which today is mostly through government-led housing, which good, bad, and ugly. But there's two particular buildings on that island which have just stuck with me forever. And one, this was on that ABC program. One was the Catholic Church, which sits on top of the hills. That's made out of granite, out of the local rock, and it's amazing. It's an amazingly cool place to be in, and it's a lump of rock, and you just sort of get inside this thing, and just positions you. It's facing directly east, so that morning light comes straight through and hits the front of the altar and all that stuff. And then there's these other structures that were built by the Australian engineering, or the army engineers, I guess, during the Second World War, which are just pure modernist bunkers. And those things really stuck with me because they're just so brutalist, but they're so well designed and so well considered. Little internal drains inside, one slot window that you could stick a cannon through, I guess. But they look like every cool bar in Berlin or somewhere. So they're really stuck with me. So I have this love of concrete because of that, and because my grandfather also built boats and was a carpenter, I have this fantastic love of carpentry.
So when you're thinking about, I guess, those, the way that is framed, the framing of that, and thinking back to that ABC program, and I wonder if there is a way of having a very bad view ever in the Torres Strait, because it's just so picturesque. But that cannon that you're talking about, the cannon window, frames it so beautifully, but that's also something that you've taken from your childhood and you've also placed into your own home in a way.
Yeah, I think the way you frame a view or make a space that kind of captures a view and brings it inside and becomes part of the character of that space, whether it's through a window or through an opening, is a really important thing. And the architects I admire do it incredibly well. And they're very careful in how they, I guess curate's one way of describing it, but sometimes you can be in a really harsh environment in the city, but if you're really clever, you can almost sneak a view that can block out the stuff you don't really want to see and give you a sense of where the horizon is. I think that's a really special thing to be able to do.
When you started to get into, I guess, the world of architecture, did you have a preconceived notion of what you were getting into? What did you expect when you first entered that industry?
No, not at all. I actually wanted to do law, and I think I was 5 points short, so I did architecture. And I have made some great friends, and many of them are here tonight at UQ. And to be honest, I never grew up with architects. I didn't know any architects. There's certainly none who came from a First Nations background. So what I came to know was purely through university, and I had friends also there who had fathers, uncles. They'd grown up around it and had a bit of a head start, I guess. But I was lucky enough in my final year to work or assist one of my lecturers at the time, Peter O'Gorman, building this timber house over at Stradbroke Island. And I think that's when the sort of penny dropped that I might stick with it. That was my final year. The final week of my final year.
So you really left it until the end of making that decision. I'm going to stick with this.
Yeah.
But what did you discover about the difference, I suppose, in what you'd learned in university to what you then had coming into the industry?
I think my experience at UQ was fantastic. I had a great time. I think in terms of where I've got to now, it sort of helped prepare in some ways, that not so much in the cultural dimension, so that sort of came about through others who sort of opened doors and sort of helped me, build confidence around thinking about culture and what it means. But certainly in terms of understanding how, the architects I do admire have a very clear idea of what it is they're doing and what they're looking towards or what they're trying to achieve. And the more I looked at different architects, not just locally, but nationally and globally, the thing they all seemed to have in common was an intellectual position, but also a cultural position from where they're from. And it just sort of got me wondering. And in particular, there's an architect who I don't particularly admire the work. I'm not going to say his name, but he became associated with being, I guess, a bit of an expert in all things Aboriginal. And I sort of thought that was a curious thing. It'd be like a male architect becoming an expert in female architecture. It seemed a bit odd. But it did help me think through what I might have to offer as a kind of counter.
So what was about that point that you thought, there has to be a deeper thinking in here about the process of how I do this? And then how do you get to this point now of where you are at, where you've really thought about, I guess, that place of belonging, I think you call it, and the way that something belongs in country and with country?
Yeah, that's a big question. There's a run-up to that. I'm going to try and answer it in parts. So I guess part of the history lessons we got at UQ was we got to understand the general history of architecture during the last century or two. And the one that kind of captured me, which still does a little bit, is the idea of modernism and what it was trying to achieve in terms of structure and free space and being connected. It ultimately failed because it thought it was better than the site and the location it was in. It thought it could just be anywhere on the planet, which means it's ignoring culture, climate, and ultimately where it is. Then there's this little brief period afterwards called postmodernism, where it started to trade more on the symbols of things and thought it was nature, but it still failed because it didn't know where it was. So now we're in this new period, I think, where possibly the structural conditions of modernism in terms of efficiency and structure, still dealing with free space, but now dealing and confronting the idea of technology and also genuine sustainability in terms of the energy crisis that we're hurtling towards. So all of those things have sort of added up to, I guess, giving some clarity around what we should be really focused on now as architects, and also what I'm very much focused on, because those things exist, but you've still got to bring some kind of cultural dimension to it and how you see people coming together. Because if you do, then you can start to unleash these other things around the difference between belonging and ownership.
So how did you start that conversation?
Just then. So, no, the great thing about, the thing I love about architecture is the way, it's not straight line thinking, you're constantly bringing a number of influences together, synthesising and trying to get the daisy chain into some kind of balance. And that's just an intellectual sort of pursuit of sorts, I guess. But I think the last 2 decades in particular, where the confidence grew, and out of the Merrimer work back in the late 90s in Sydney, that it was the right thing to do to see the way we might live in this country through not just a cultural dimension, but one on behalf of the country that the building or the site's belonging to. And if you could achieve an architecture that puts people in a relationship with that, a really beautiful relationship, like the red box hanging off here, when you're in that space, it's one of the few spaces on the river that actually feels like you're in the river. If you can make spaces like that, people start to get attached to them. They have a sense of belonging to them. And the basis of that is like a genuine sort of affection for that kind of experience. But ultimately, if you belong to something, you look after it, which is a very different thing to saying, actually, I just own that as a piece of property. And your behaviour is very different, I think. So I think the real power of architecture is that it can in this country, the way we might think about it, is less about the symbols and the aesthetics, although they have a place, but more about just the fundamental connection that these spaces can deliver in terms of making them fall in love with the country they're in.
Did you have to go through a process? I mean, there's when you're in university, you get taught in a certain way. There's a certain way that you do things, there's a certain way that you then go out and do your job in. And I wonder about how that thinking for you had to switch to where you realised that really the central core of what was going to make your work worthwhile and make an understanding for you was coming back to that cultural core, to the centre of who you are, because that was the strength that you were bringing with you.
Yeah. We were very much taught in the Western canon and UQ, and that's fine to understand that aspect of the history of architecture and what's come to influence, I guess, the Australian situation. But I don't really think the penny, like I said, didn't drop until I was working on that house at Stradbroke, and then the way Peter would talk about it was very much, I recognised a lot of the sort of structures we make up in the islands that are more to do with shade structures between things, like very informal. And that house is just made out of timber. It's 2 boxes with a courtyard in between and a walkway, but everything's external for the most part. And I recognise something in it straight away, and I went, this could be in the islands, and it's on an island. So that's when one penny dropped, I think. But then the following year, meeting with Dylan Combermary, who's the First Nations architect who was in Sydney, and we hit it off and then set up that Merrimah thing. I think that's where it just flourished, because we, even though we're in the deep end, we're able to sort of, have someone to talk to about it. We were the only 2 graduates at that time in the whole country. So we had a fantastic set of opportunities, and we had a lot of support from a lot of the other architects in Sydney, including the government architect, and it just sort of went on from there, I guess. But this side of 2000 is when it sort of really exponentially kind of developed, I think.
What do you think the importance is of knowing who you are when you're in a job like architecture?
Oh, you should just know yourself generally anyway, whatever job you're in, I think. And sometimes people come to that a bit late, but I think in all things you want to find the authentic, whether it's in a person or in our case in the architecture, and you can sift them out pretty quick when they're not. But it can take, sometimes people just need a bit of encouragement, and I think particularly in First Nations backgrounds, encouragement and support is actually what's really well needed, just to sort of get our mob to kind of, open the doors themselves and find things.
Leadership is a word that comes up a lot, but I wonder do you see yourself as a leader?
It keeps getting thrown at me a bit. I think there's 2 aspects to it. There's one where you're through demonstration and doing more work as an architect, and working on much bigger budgets, and these days, just purely by doing that, people start to point and go, well, there's something going on here, and there's a leader in that field. But I think like genuine leadership comes from, that's one half of it. The other half's then passing it on or bringing others with you. So probably the part of the leadership I'm enjoying is more mentoring younger First Nation architects that are coming through. There's some really fantastic ones, which is great, because it means I'm getting closer to retirement and obsolescence. So.
Well, what kind of, how would you describe your leadership, your style of leadership?
Oh, absolutely authoritarian. So, do it this way. No, I think there's a strive for excellence, so you've got to have that first. But there's ways of doing it. There is the authoritarian way, which, funnily enough, in the Western canon of works that we were taught, that pops up a lot in terms of being the absolute kind of expert. so I certainly started my career in that footprint, thinking that's how I had to be. But as I've drifted more into, bigger and bigger work with bigger groups, and then you become much more aware that there's a lot of people in the room who are going to influence this outcome, and I'm just one part of it. Like, I think the way I'm practicing now is purely in co-design. So I know what my contribution is as an architect, but in terms of the project and the life of it and what it's supporting, that takes so many other people. I think one of the great things about being at BVN has been that sort of idea of the collective creativity to make things. So when you switch your thinking to that, you can be in a room with people from all walks of life, different age groups, everything, and if you're just listening for what those contributions might be, there's always something much better that comes out of it.
Do you like the collaboration side of that more and working as a collective more? Do you think that is something that you enjoy more than just, being by yourself or coming in and out?
Yeah, I do actually, a lot more. There's a couple of projects that just flicked up where I was just doing it by myself, and that was fine, but certainly you're getting much more out of these bigger projects with more people. But even the smaller ones, so those theatre sets I do on the side once or twice a year, you walk into a room and you're with a lighting designer and a sound designer and a writer and an actor, and no one's there to sort of compromise, because otherwise you get a compromised outcome. So the idea is like everyone's bringing their expertise to the conversation, and it just makes something you could never imagine by yourself. And it's just like, I think the more of those I did, the more relaxed I became about being a lot more open about how the architecture could develop in that space. So it's a really good thing.
Do you think that, I guess, that need to collaborate and that need for that collectiveness, do you think that came from a lot of the work that you'd done earlier on when you were building schools, when you were out in communities and trying to solve problems or issues of the ways that buildings worked as a function of how that worked culturally but also socially, and all of the protocols that come with that too?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think particularly if you're working in First Nations communities, you'd be a very brave person to sort of come in and lay down how it's going to be. Probably foolish, I'd say. So just through an obligation to the culture of how things are, you have to have a broader conversation, and it's not about just getting a brief and what do you like sort of thing. It's actually walking and developing the ideas of whatever that project is from beginning to end, and more often than not, years later. So I still get calls from projects that I, started in the mid to late 90s, early 2000s, and there's still connections there with people who are, how do we change this light bulb, or how do we do this, whatever it is. So I think that's nice, because you just realise like the building's one thing, but if you step back from it and go, what the building's supporting is this whole culture of living and all these experiences, and they become memories within that place, then and you think about that sort of unlocks, I think, where the architecture can be really powerful.
Have you ever had a time when there's been a disconnect between what you've been working with, say the community for instance, versus the person who's, got you to go in there to create, this project and to do this work, and how have you managed that situation in the past?
No, to be honest, and touch wood, it never happens. There's two kind of projects. There's the ones we win commercially through tendering and all that sort of stuff, where you kind of have to complete and do it. And there's others where we've been approached and brought in, just directly engaged, and on that basis, it's easier to make the decisions together about whether things are going in the right direction or not, and then if not, get out of the way and help on behalf of the project, connect those people with people who might be a better fit. So that's happened once or twice, but on really good terms, and I think that's the thing. If you focus on what can you do on behalf of the project, as opposed to on behalf of yourself, then it's a much better service, I think.
Tell me about finding country and the concept of finding country.
Oh, okay. So Finding Country was began in about 2005, and it started out of a conversation with a mentor of mine, a guy called Michael Markham in Melbourne. He's a Fulbright scholar, and we're walking through Brisbane City back in 2005, and he asked me, if you could take stuff out of the city, what would you take? And I said, well, I'll take all these buildings because they're in the way of what we understand were old, campgrounds, waterholes, all these sorts of things that were part of the original place. But I said, well, that'd be the first part. And he goes, well, that's a bit of editing, but if you had to go right up to, half, how would you take half the city away? And well, you'd have to start by taking away the buildings that aren't used or are useless now. That's the next layer, So the chat went, and I went away and started thinking about this more, and it turned into this idea of Finding Country. And what we imagined was, or what we asked people to imagine is, if you thought half the population of a city was gone, and you were given an eraser, and you had to erase half the city, how would you do it? And then you had to be clear about what your logic was for doing it. So that was the sort of question. And the reason we formulated together this sort of idea was that typically architects are part of building going on and on and on and on, and we're always at the periphery of the city that's just expanding. What would happen if you came back to the centre and cleaned up the bits that weren't working? So how could you actually empty a city by design, as opposed to allowing a city to kind of just fall into sort of points of failure? And there's history's littered with cities that have failed through catastrophe. That's the short answer.
Yeah.
So what we did with that, so in 2012 we had about 40 friends, and we gave them a page out of the street directory of Brisbane, and asked them to do that. Imagine half the population gone, empty the grid, give us your logic for why you did it, so that we had 40 odd different ideas of how you would do it and why you could do it. And then we assembled this big drawing that was 3 by 6 or 7 metres, and that got exhibited at the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2012, and it was supported by a number of people, which is just fantastic to get something like that up and have an actual presence. It's the first time anything like that, particularly with the First Nations sort of narrative, had been presented at the Biennale.
And so then how have you built on that work of, I guess, the rethinking that goes on in this space, about thinking about what a building sits on and the stories that lie underneath that, and how you bring those stories to the fore into something that's that just sits in that space?
Well, I think that thing was just a little intellectual project, and then I came back, and QUT were very generous. It offered me a small professorship for 3 years to develop it as a studio with master's students. So we tried it, and then got some traction, and then we developed the idea of what was actually happening. So if you take away all the bits about city, all the bits about city and whatnot, what we're really talking about is how it's the difference between carving and tattooing. So when you carve something, it's not that you're deleting or demolishing something, you're taking something away to make a new thing. It could be a handle. But if you think about that in terms of how you might think about not just the city, but a building and a door handle, for example, it's a different way of making space at all the scales, as opposed to tattooing, which is you just keep adding on top of. So it just sort of mushroomed, and then that contract finished. University of Sydney gave me another contract to do a similar thing, and we just kept ratcheting the idea up. So I got to the end of that, and then I realised the students were cottoning on because all the work was getting published, so they could see what the previous studio did. And then it got to the point at the University of Sydney where I realised the students were smarter than me, so I stopped. And then BVN approached with this idea of like, well, okay, you've been thinking about it, how would you actually make it happen in bigger practice? And that's where it's gone from being an idea to being practiced now. So, and that's heaps of fun.
Yeah, so what are those elements then of when you're putting it into practice?
Well, it's applying it, right? So just that idea of carving, so of thinking that everything that's built and around us is permanent. And, you know, we can see buildings as architects that don't perform just on a basic level in terms of whether they don't function in terms of getting from A to B, but we can also see the ones that don't function in terms of the energy draw they've got. So, you know, you can very quickly figure out, you know, anyone should be able to figure it out walking around any city, you know, what seems quietly out, you know, what's out of place and what could be done better or what needs to go. Some of the projects we've got going at the moment as, oh God, I'm trying to think of them. I just presented one this morning, which is for, I can't say what it is actually. But we started with the idea of the site not being an isolated thing, that we realised that the site belonged to this bigger piece of country that had its own geology, had its own hydrology, which in turn had its own flora, which in turn has its own fauna. So very quickly, just in geographical terms, you can analyse and understand better why Aboriginal people occupied it. And you can flick into the anthropology and go, oh yeah, of course, why wouldn't you be here? There was water and there was food sources and all these sorts of things. But the minute you stop seeing the site as just being a box or the boundary line, and you see the systems that this thing actually belongs to or has been cut off, you can restore the systems. So you can empty the things that are the blockages, so you remove those. Pretty much every building has a building envelope. So rather than assembling within it, the diagrams just start as a mass, and I carve stuff out and go, can I set this view up to that mountain, or can I, you know, set a view up to the sky from the ground, or where can I put my foot on the ground? Purely by just removing mass of the building, and it's we're starting to get some good traction. I think probably the most recent example of a project finished is the one, the Brisbane State South Secondary College over at Dutton Park. There's a lot of S's. I think they, I won't say what the nickname is, but I think that was a fabulous project, because it's essentially a giant series of courtyards that are just framing views of either hills to the east, the mountain ranges to the south on the horizon, out to Mount Cootha, what that means. And it's just done in a really subtle way. So, you know, when you're in those amazing spaces with really beautiful views, you don't need signage telling you what it is. If you're curious, you'll find out. And that's the thing that I think makes or imbues this idea of affection into the spaces.
Yeah, so if someone's thinking about that, of going, well, how do I change my practice? How do I start to think about this in a way that makes sense in bringing in all those things that we've just spoken about? What would you say is the first step of trying to change the thinking and change the rewiring in the brain of how you approach a project from the start?
Well, at the moment, the big thing I'm into is this idea of belonging, and it's not just on behalf of a person being in a particular kind of space like the red box over here. It's seeing very clearly what the site of the project belongs to, because then you can see the cycles that it's part of, and all of that adds up to the character of those spaces over the course of the year in terms of the seasons. And just really easily by doing that desktop research into the geography of place, you start with what you're standing on, what water performs on it, flora, fauna. You can make a decision about how much of that cycle you want to engage in, and I encourage architects and clients to think about it in those terms, because if you connect into it, then you can do it in a very special way.
If you do have a Slido question for Kevin, just a reminder that we will be taking questions very soon, and there's some questions coming in at the moment, but be sure to get onto Slido so that I can ask Kevin your question. And if you leave your name too, that'd be really great, so we know who the questions come from. Kevin, I guess, on this journey that you've had, what do you think is the biggest thing that you've learnt along the way?
I think probably the biggest thing is the labels that get put on things. I often get called a male architect, an Indigenous architect, all sorts of things. And, in the end, when I look at the bit of paper I got from UQ and my registrations, it just says you're an architect. So to me, architecture is just, that's what it is. It's the, it requires someone who's got a capability to think through and analyse a number of competing factors at the same time and find some kind of synthesis within it and deliver something that's fundamentally memorable in the experiences that it sets up.
Do you feel like you're a disruptor in this sector?
I've been called that and worse. I think the great thing about Brisbane is everyone, and there's some of the great architects here in the room, but everyone's just doing their thing on their project. I'm the same, and we're not going looking for those sorts of labels and descriptions, but sometimes they sort of, they do come my way, and I try not to entertain them.
But do you think there's a beauty in disrupting?
Oh no, for sure, absolutely.
And that sometimes that's where those points that you really then get to dig into come from, when you've challenged something or you've put something else out there that isn't the norm and people look at you as though you are maybe slightly, losing it. But that's part of it, is that experimentation, that is also part of disrupting too.
Yeah.
It's trying something different, putting something new out there, thinking in a different way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's a way of doing it where you keep it on an intellectual level, and it's just by saying, well, why is that glass round and a cylinder? Couldn't it be square and more pointy or something? And then you find out the hard way that it fails. But then there's a different kind of disrupting, I think, which is more emotional or passionate, which can get a little bit loose and crazy. I hope I'm never in that space. I'm definitely not in that space, I don't think. So I think the premise of Finding Country was disruptive because it forced, the idea was to force architects back to the centre and go empty by design rather than add by design, which is what we're typically trained to do. So, and it was just an idea. It wasn't, something I was forcing down people's necks or anything like that. So it was an important one because it was a question rather than saying this is the answer, this is how you must do it. So if you could set the perfect questions that make people think, I think that's the ideal for me.
The longer that you've been in this industry, how do you build on and improve your practice?
Well, you got to stay curious. That's the first thing. Got to stay, I think, absolutely open to the critique, like a critique from both the positive and the negative side of the argument. I've always been interested in that because I think that's where genuine tension lies, and that's where you can take things to another level in terms of thinking. I think the worst thing is to be, if you're surrounded by people saying yes, no, you're giving you positive critiques, it's not actually helping, set the next layer of questions.
Is there a skill in giving good critique, and is there a skill in taking that critique? Because sometimes the taking of the critique can be also the tension point.
Yeah, I think so. There is a skill, and I think maybe the way we received a critique back in the day at the University of Queensland was slightly harsher and more direct and pretty insensitive, I would say, watching what kind of destroyed a lot of people. I think it's very different now. That sort of behaviour is not tolerated. It does still exist in parts of the industry, but I think it's something that's sort of moving out rapidly with the old dinosaurs, which is good. So now things are more focused on the idea of things. Yes, all the pragmatics around cost and all those things you have to do as architects, but what we're finding when you do genuinely work in a more collaborative way, is that once you understand where people are coming from in the room, you can usually find a way through it. So, you know, the big project we're doing out in Alice Springs, the new National Gallery of Aboriginal Art, which is it's a big job. It's really complex, but all the people working on it from all different walks of life, from the government side to the engineering side to our side, the builders will be coming in shortly. It's just been such a fantastic process because everyone's gets space to say what their concern is and where they think problems are, and you kind of problem solve the thing together, it's really good. It's a really good culture because when you're stuck in with a group of people for 4 or 5 years on a project, life's too short to fight every day, I think.
What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Oh, God. Pass. I said I wouldn't give you a one-word answer, didn't I? Oh, God. I don't know. I'll have to think about that one. I'll come back to you in the end.
Yeah. You mentioned before that there have been people along the way that have mentored you, that have been there in support. And I wonder if there was anyone in that who really shaped your thinking and understanding of the things that you've gone on to do.
Yeah, Rui Thompson, Māori fella from across the ditch. He passed away a few years ago. I was lucky to speak at his funeral, but he was a massive influence, and I met him in 1999. So there's Dylan and I, you imagine we're two young punks. Well, I was young, Dylan's a little bit older. And we could only talk to each other, and then Alison Page joined. But in terms of architecture, Dylan and I were trying to find our way, and then we met Rui, who was 10 years older. He was doing some amazing things over in New Zealand, and we hit it off. And then he became one of my supervisors on my Master of Philosophy research, postgrad research in the early 2000s. And part of that was we had to meet over the period of about 4 years, and we really got to know each other. And we'd meet over there or over here, and I really got into. He's such a staunch Māori and into his culture and the way of things, but he also felt limited in New Zealand because of the mud-eyes with the gables. And he's like, everyone wants this gable thing, and he's like, I don't do gables. And he looked over here in Australia and said, oh, you guys can do anything. And I go, well, no, apparently we have to do curves and sticks and stones and stuff. And he kept asking me, what is it? What is it you're concerned about? And I said, well, I think the challenge for not just everyone, but in particular First Nation people here is our relationship with modernity and technology. Like that to me is where that's the next frontier. It really is really important to me.
Do you think there are many instances of those things, like the duality of, for instance, we were talking about leadership before, and the duality that exists between the difference between cultural leadership and then business leadership, and how those two exist in your world? And is that the same with, those conversations that you would have with him?
Yeah, we never talked about business. We talked about culture and architecture, and because he loved rugby, and so did I. So we had to go and do these meetings around Bledisloe Cup games, whether they were there or here, which was great. So I got to see a lot of games, and then we had very long conversations around it, and it was never about the business. It was always about the idea of how your culture, as in anyone's culture, how can that actually inform the way you might think about the way you live and what you live in and how you do it.
Do you think that's a difference that others should think about? Is that the relational relationship that you have, rather than it being constantly about business, that it is more about the personal, about getting to know, forming that relationship?
Yeah, to an extent, but there's certain instances where being transactional is really important as well. But equally, there's places where you think it would be like that, and it's not. So I know the other partners at our practice, yes, on paper, it's a transaction. We are the owners. We are liable for this thing. But the language we use is, which I sort of brought to the table, is that we're really just custodians of this business. And if you think about it as it's inanimate, but if we want to give it this life, then we can't really own it. All we can do is get the right people to it to keep the life in it. So, if you think about it in those terms, then it does adjust the way you behave, because you're doing everything on behalf of the business itself. The decisions you make down the track, a lot of them are transactional, because at some certain points you've got to issue a bill and say, well, we did this and you should pay us and all that sort of stuff. That's important. But I find there's more success in all of that stuff when it is relational. I don't know, I just get something more meaningful out of the whole point. So,
Well, I mean, designing with country is kind of the place where everything is at right now, and I wonder about, with that becoming more common in how these projects are starting to come together, the collaborative nature of those projects. I mean, how is that changing the way that those projects work, and what are the challenges in that space at the moment?
Oh yeah, that's good. So the designing with country, I can tell you that came out of this opportunity with QUT, because they, after I was doing those studios, there was a bit broader conversation going on with the PBC Indigenous office. Facilities were curious about it. They're like, yeah, this is all good and fine, you're doing this studio about it, but how would you actually start to formulate a framework for how we might actually develop buildings? And I was like, oh, I'll come back to you. And went away and thought about it, and I thought, well, maybe there has to be something really instructive about it that isn't limiting at the same time, and it can't be just a matter of words like that. It has to be demonstrated. So any architect or any project manager could pick this document up, and then with that in mind, the concept of country and culture, have a clear pathway into how they might pursue it without, I guess, resorting to the usual sort of stereotypical responses and things. So that document was the basis of coming up with this designing with country kind of methodology, which we've put together with other members of BVN, and we've put it out there for the industry to use if they'd like. But just, I think the first origin of it was that campus to country document for QUT, which really helped. You need those projects that then solidify the thinking. And in that, it just said there's a couple of basic mechanisms you can do to bring parts of country back, or put people in a relationship with it. And it's not about deleting buildings, erasing things. It's actually about putting something there that needs to be back there. And there's a diagram that came out of it, which is this layered diagram, and some of it came from conversations with Noel Pearson. But it was sort of saying, if we look over our shoulder in history, we've got these three layers of history. There's the First Nation layer, then there's the colonial layer, and then post-white Australia policy, we get the multicultural layer, then we get the project. And if that's a piece of building, it therefore seems reasonable to pick parts of those three layers and bring them into some kind of synthesis rather than separating them. But then in front of us, the thing we can never get in front of is technology, because it becomes obsolete the minute you specify it. And then in front of that again is like, what's our position globally? What are we contributing? And that again is just racing towards whatever we think it's racing towards. So there's always a project that sort of sets up this another piece of framework. So we've got the Design with Country framework now, which is one half is around that geography anthropology analysis, but then on the back half it's actually saying now these are there's examples of how you actually use those prompts to start imbuing the project with this idea of how you connect with country. You don't have to use all of them. You might just use one and do it exceptionally well. And that's the thing we've put out and started to share with the whole industry.
And I'm just assuming, Kevin, that in terms of capacity of Indigenous architects in the sector, that you could always do with more. But if this is the way that those projects are going, is that bringing others into the sector that might not necessarily have trained, bringing other expertise in that's not necessarily architectural as well?
Look, absolutely, because there's, I think Queensland is well behind the ball in this matter. I think QUT really is leading the way when they did this document. New South Wales now has a Connecting with Country guideline that's part of the planning pathway for major projects in New South Wales. So I think it's anything over 50 million in value, you must, as part of the planning pathway, go through it's basically a design process where you have to present what you're doing and demonstrate how it's acknowledging or how is it incorporating these things to do with country. And they're really pushing the idea in a genuine and authentic way, I think. So the words have turned into actions, and now the buildings are following, and it's a really good thing because I think I wish we had the sort of political will to do more of that up here. Victoria's following very closely behind as well. So they're little feathers in the cap. I mean, we Dylan, I think one of the reasons we got success in New South Wales is because Dylan stayed at the Government Architect's office, and I you know, jetted off around the world and did other things, and he's still there, you know, fighting the fight. And you know, it's great seeing him this morning because the policy only got launched a few months ago, and it's you know, we were talking about this back in the 90s, and finally, you know, almost 30 years later, it turns up, which is great.
I'll ask you one final question before I come to Slido. So if you do have a Slido question, please pop it in there for Kevin. But Kevin, what do you think the future of architecture looks like for you?
I think I'm going to be really positive about it because I'm not old enough to be cynical just yet. But I think we've got to be positive, and the more we become aware of what's really fantastic and really unique about where we are here, I think the more people hopefully will start to understand how you know, terrific architecture can be when it starts to connect you to it. And it's not going to come out of the big, you know, housing estates that are typically just mowing everything down and really destroying those connections. It's going to come out of people thinking sensitively and you know, beyond the context of just owning something. So I'm kind of excited about it, and particularly this next generation of younger architects that I keep coming into contact with at various universities. Like they're so smart. It's just fantastic.
First question from Slido is, how can we maintain spaces better rather than continuing to build new spaces?
How can we maintain spaces better rather than continuing to build new spaces? Well, I mean, maintenance goes with every building. Look, my big picture view of that is I think buildings that are obsolete or energy drains should be removed. Alternatively, on the way to removal, if that's not the, you know, sort of final destination of it, they should be seriously refurbished with this thought of regeneration in mind. So we have to make buildings smarter, less energy reliant, and but also just better places to be in, and, you know, be with other people in.
Universities are indigenising curricula. What would that mean for architecture and allied disciplines?
I honestly don't know. I've sort of steered clear of that whole agenda. I guess I'm just so focused on architecture and what it can be, and I've been told what I'm doing is indigenising architecture, and it wasn't the intention. It was just like every other architect I know who draws on their own cultural experience, and they're doing their thing. So yeah, I'm not sure where that one's going to go in the end.
It's another label.
Yeah, look, it could be, but equally then I've seen some younger, certainly First Nation graduates in other universities who are doing some really good stuff in that space and trying to build awareness. But I'm just focused on demonstrating what good architecture can be, and how to work through much more complex and significant pieces of work. I guess that's sort of where my head's at the moment. So we need those built examples so people can point at it and go, right, well, that's where the beachhead is. Now next generation's got to go beyond it. So.
Do you have a favourite project? This one's from Jane, and what was memorable about it for you?
Favourite project? As in one of my projects or someone else's?
I'm assuming maybe yours, because it's about you.
Oh, okay. All right. I think there might have been an image come up before. It's the black box, which is made of white panels. So it's definitely that's the thing. Because I was commissioned by Urban Theatre Projects in Western Sydney about 10 years ago, and they wanted and the conversation started off, they wanted this little sound pavilion, and they wanted it to look more like a humpy and sticks and stones. And I said, I'm probably not the right guy for that. I said, but if you want to make a space that's technically tuned for sound and how to do it, and its image is modern, and in the way when I go to Bangarra, they dance in a modern way. They still have a connection to the past, but they are like what's on the horizon. That's where we're going. That's what we're going to do with this project. So there it is. That's it. So what you can't see inside it is that there's an asymmetrical egg shape, and I took it off this building early 20th century in Stockholm by a Swedish architect, and he had a couple, and I think one of them was partly deaf, and he made this sort of egg-shaped room so that the sound, it couldn't be round because otherwise you get the weird acoustic in the centre, and by just making it slightly asymmetrical as an egg, it deflected the focusing of the sound, and it's the perfect room for sound. So I copied it and stuck it in the middle of that, and it's all polycarbonate. So Andrew Browning, who was on the Away program at ABC, he would commission sound pieces, and the white would be on the outside. The inside was just changing colour the whole time, and you just get this sound work that would kind of just resonate through your whole body, and a lot of it hit harmonics, which meant the whole structure hummed, and the idea of it was that it would travel around as a pavilion. So it's been to Sydney, Melbourne, out to Western Sydney a few times, back that's at Barangaroo. I think it's coming up to the coast in the next year or two. I think that's probably my favourite one at the moment. And you're only ever as good as your last project anyway, so.
How should we accelerate reflecting in our public realm proper recognition of 60,000 years of First Nations peoples belonging, being and knowing?
I think one should start with language, because every place has its own language. And I go to the dawn service most years, and the first language you hear is Māori. And I've always been curious, why aren't we hearing our language, or the language of the place, the country we're in? So whether that's through didactics or whether it's this is where I think public art has a really powerful responsibility to sort of bring more of that to us, sort of reveal where we are and what we're missing or what we don't see. So.
What makes architecture female or male?
I have no idea. I'm going to dodge that one.
How did you find transitioning from authoritarian to co-design? Was it difficult?
No, transitioning was easy. I never really was into authoritarian carry-on. So the more I got to read about, the great sort of Western architects, the more I realised they were socially challenged, and I don't think I wanted to be like that. That was an easy one, I just realised the work was a little bit thin, in the end.
What are your opinions on, I think it's circularity in architecture, adaptive reuse, reusing existing building as a material for the new construction?
Yes, maybe, and possibly. So circularity is a good thing. We want to reduce, like our industry, we're part of a big construction industry that's generating, greenhouse gases and not helping the planet at all. So anything to do with adaptive reuse, I think, is a good thing. And obviously, the circularity is part of that thinking. Reusing existing building materials and material for new construction, not always. That can generate more power. So it just depends on what that is. So, but a lot of the projects I've been involved with now involve a lot of reconstruction and adaptive reuse, which I sort of start with as a point.
If you had to choose between one functionality and aesthetic, which one and why?
Yeah, so I wouldn't. I'd choose tension. So the tension's the thing between the two, and you've got to get that right. So if you focus on that, the other two will find their right place.
How much are architects responsible for preserving biodiversity, and how can we enable biodiversity?
I think the responsibility is every citizen. That's where it's got to start, and everything we do in whatever walk of life we have and how we can affect and influence things, that's really where it is. And I think we need that biodiversity, because the minute you put a fence around a property, you've just turned it into its own little world. And yes, it might have its own little biodiversity, but it's just disconnected itself from the bigger cycles of that particular part of country, which I don't think is healthy. So architects as citizens, we're responsible as much as everyone else.
Is that why you don't have a fence?
Yep.
Have you had projects fail? Good question. And what did you learn from them?
Did I have any projects fail? I can't. Oh, yes, there's one, and which I got fired from, and I was asked to do an entry for the Woodford Folk Festival, the main entry. They wanted an entry pavilion, and I knew full well what they actually wanted, and I can't do sticks and stones, so they got a piece of Black Panther right up front. So it was a very high-tech thing, and they decided I wasn't the right person.
You're ahead of your time. How much does human psychology impact the way you design and create spaces?
A lot, and I wish I had majored in psychology, I think, when I went through university, because I'm becoming more aware of it. Going through midlife, you can start to see cycles of how people behave and change and emotively adapt, and then you can see why a room with a little bit of light is very different to a room with a lot of light, and the sense of a big generous space like this, as opposed to one that's compressing you, like pretty much every apartment off Montague Road. They affect your well-being, and it's something I'm wanting to learn more about.
Regarding cultural activation, this is from, I think, Kale. Sorry if I've pronounced your name wrong. Regarding cultural activation in your designs, can you talk about a project where you felt most satisfied with the end product?
Oh, geez, cultural activation. I'm not sure. I guess it is deliberate. It's there, but no different to any other architect. I think the one is probably in Casino, the little Aboriginal health centre in Casino. The great thing about Casino is this beautiful town west of Lismore. It's all brick, beef capital of New South Wales, and it was wealthy back in the day. So there's these beautiful brick buildings with all the details. We did this very flat brick building, one bond, one brick, and the only special brick I did was cut the corners off them, and then we had a window that faced 90 degrees to the front elevation, and it framed a view of the Catholic Church down the road, which had a bit of a checkered history with the Aboriginal community, and that was it. But all the pattern of, there were two patterns of these cut bricks on the facade, and one was sort of alluding to, it was twice as dense as the other one. It was alluding to the loss of, women's loss of kids. So the water would hit the cut in the brick, and so it's got these sort of tear runs down the face of it, and then the other was meant to be male. It's not as bad, so, but it was all to do with this sort of relationship with the church building down the road. That was, it was, when we got there, that was a pretty strong moment, I thought.
I think we've got time for one more. I'm going to try and squeeze one more in. Do you think AI will heavily impact architecture?
It has been for 20 years, 25 years. So the minute we started using all these computer-aided design programs, which I've started to fall behind in, to generate and take away the task of drawing every little thing, it started, and it's going to continue to impact. But touch wood, it can't replicate connection between people and that connection to the bit of country you're in. Who knows?
Well, on that note, Kevin, thank you so much. Can you please put your hands together for Kevin O'Brien? And can you keep those applause going for our Auslan interpreters, Candice and Kelly? I'd now like to welcome Professor Cameron Newton from QUT to the stage to conclude tonight's conversation.
Thanks, Rhianna, and thank you, Kevin, for sharing your story tonight, and Rhianna for facilitating such an engaging and inspiring conversation. I get the fun part of the night of trying to reflect and sum up, and as a psychologist, I'm very happy to say that I think you've already got a major in psychology. Some of the first words I heard tonight were fangirl, and I think I've heard it 3 times. So consider yourself lucky. Well, in some cases, maybe not in other cases. What I took away from tonight and what I'd like to reflect on tonight was some of the words that I heard around what influences you. And I think there are learnings for us also. One of the first phrases I heard was striving to make work meaningful, and what influences us and what makes us. And I heard about the influence of the lived experience, our childhoods, families, cultural backgrounds, buildings, Catholic church, top of a hill, a lump of rock, World War II bunkers, framing a view. Others, and our own intellectual and cultural positions, and the influence that has on us owning our own style and developing our own style. And in your case, of architecture, synthesising sustainability, cultural backgrounds, technology, belonging in an organic way. And I hope I've done justice in summing up what I feel you have presented to us tonight, and some learnings for us tonight. The notion of creating a powerful connection between people and space, and considering the system that we live in, is just such a powerful message, and one that I'll certainly take home. Another one I'll take home is the importance of authenticity, and I thought, yes, he's talked about authentic, because to me you sound like an extraordinarily authentic person. And then your next word you said was authoritarian, and honestly, in all crudeness, my first thought was, that's bullshit. There is no way. So I was very happy to hear that you transitioned very quickly from being an authoritarian person to someone who understands the value of co-design, the value of collaboration, the value of mentoring, both receiving it and also giving it, and being able to create something that's larger than the sum of the parts. They weren't the words you used, but I think they were the things that you were saying. And also, the other takeaway I'll have, and I love this idea, is the notion of erasing half a city or half of something. No, it doesn't have to be a city, it can be an organisation, it can be a team. Not QUT, don't get me wrong. This might be the last time I do this. It could be anything, but the notion of erasing half of something and rebuilding it in a way that works better maybe, or has a different interpretation or a different meaning. A very, very powerful evening, and I thank you very much. To revisit the conversation or share it with friends or colleagues, you'll find a recording available on the Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame website within the week. On behalf of founding partners, QUT State Library, I'd like to thank the partners and sponsors who make the work of the Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame possible. Your ongoing support and commitment enables Queenslanders to gain new insights from game-changing business leaders such as Kevin O'Brien. For those here in the audience tonight, don't forget to visit the State Library's latest architecture exhibition, Purpose Built. I've been there. It is absolutely fantastic, well worth a visit on this level as you leave, I think, in that direction. Please join me in thanking Kevin O'Brien and Rhianna Patrick once more. And this is our last Game Changers for the year, so we look forward to seeing you back here in 2024 for more Game Changers events. Thank you very much. Thanks.